I just got done watching a fairly recent video, uh, Michael Malice show with Tom Woods as a guest. And these are two gentlemen I have an incredible amount of respect for. Definitely enjoy their material. One of the topics that came up was dealing with the concept of national divorce. And although I do like the idea in principle, I honestly don't see it as anything other than a whimsical thought at best. So, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, national divorce is the idea of essentially the country breaking apart into multiple entities, two, maybe more, and it happens entirely peacefully. All sides just agree, yeah, we're not getting along well. Instead of this turning into something something violent, let's just make agreements and we all go our own separate ways. And so to give them their due, one of the things they pointed out, they said, well, you think about it, a few years ago, this is a topic that people wouldn't even have talked about. And that's absolutely true. So here I am talking about it. So that part they're absolutely correct on. But where it goes from there, I think, is very questionable. Uh, if history's a guide, I would say uh, the two most likely outcomes are in this order. Number one, nothing like it even happens. Number two, if it does happen, it's more likely to end up being violent than it is peaceful. Uh, Keep in mind that many movements have started up, become very popular, talked about, actively pursued, and end up going absolutely nowhere. Not only not going anywhere, going in the exact opposite direction that the people who were working in the movement wanted. A good example being the non intervention movement of the 30s. Not only did they not get what they wanted, but we went from not just merely intervening in the next war, but becoming a country that's in a state of permanent intervention around the world. Uh, and that was a fairly popular cause, and it failed miserably. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the last time we talked about peaceful divorce. They didn't use the same term, they used the term secession. Uh, Back in the 1850s, and this is something I know Tom Woods knows very, very well. He is very knowledgeable on the Civil War. So prior to the Civil War, people weren't gathering out and saying, "Hey, let's fight a big bloody battle and fight to the death over the concept of breaking up into separate countries." That wasn't the plan. The plan was a peaceful secession. Uh, the South, for the most part, realized that over the long term, they could not secede if the North didn't choose to allow it. We saw the same problem come up during Andrew Jackson's reign. One of the states, South Carolina, decided that they came on the verge of secession, and essentially Jackson threatened them with military force, and they decided not to. In this case, talk of secession came up, uh, and most people assumed if it did happen, it would be a relatively peaceful event. Again, people weren't, except maybe the abolitionists, people weren't calling for bloody war. So when secession started occurring, actually, there were a lot of people assuming that it would happen and follow through. Washington, D.C., in the interim between Buchanan and Lincoln, there were actually government functions who were setting up to create the diplomatic arrangements required in order to stay in communication with what appeared to be a bunch of new states that would be separate countries from ours forming up. Initially, it wasn't clear that the seceding states were going to form their own union or confederation. Uh, so everything was moving in the direction of the assumption that this secession was going to be allowed to happen, and that uh, essentially it would be amiable. The groups would figure out how to uh, deal with trade issues and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things people get very wrong about Buchanan is they chide him for being essentially weak in the face of this secession, when in fact uh, he looked at it as he didn't want to be the one who ended up starting a civil war over this. And the big item that occurred, and you should listen carefully because it's part of what's going to happen again if we go down this road, is the issue started happening where when a state seceded, they said, well, now I got these federal bases or base in my state. They're not welcome here anymore. And, obviously there were some in the federal government saying, yeah, we should resist and hold these bases at all costs. Whereas President Buchanan said, no, let's not start a war over this. And essentially various bases uh, stood their ground. They were surrounded by local militia. And when they ran out of food and supplies, they essentially lowered the American flag, gathered up their stuff, and left. This happened at a bunch of different bases. And so it looked like we were on the road to a peaceful secession initially. The problem is when Lincoln finally made it to office, uh, and there's varying opinions on exactly what happened at this point. I know Tom Woods would say that Lincoln was deliberately trying to push civil war. I personally think Lincoln blundered into it. I think he was essentially the equivalent of an inept hillbilly who ended up in the highest office of the land, was surrounded by advisors that he didn't know how to deal with, and essentially made a very horrible mistake at Fort Sumter uh, that ended up triggering a civil war that I don't think he wanted. But it doesn't matter whether he wanted it or not, it happened. So the problem came down to is uh, the South was assuming Fort Sumter would be turned over in the manner that the several other military installations already had, and they were actually negotiating with the federal government to try to make sure this was going to end up being peaceful, that the North wasn't going to attempt to resupply Fort Sumter, and negotiations kind of broke down, and kaboom, war, and then yeah, several 100,000 people dead, and probably a huge setback that we probably never fully recovered from. So, in the conversation, Michael Malice suggested that the breakup of the United States, this national divorce he and Tom were talking about, would be kind of like a business. And the two partners would be deciding how to split up the company cars. And that was his analogy for nuclear weapons. And I find that an excessively naive comparison. And again, I have the utmost respect for Michael Malice. Uh, he's absolutely fantastic. He is, I love his stuff out on Twitter. I love his videos. Most of the time, I'm in full agreement with what he has to say. And if I don't agree, he at least makes me think about the topics he's bringing up. But the idea that nukes are kind of like business assets between two partners who are dissolving their partnership is poorly thought out, I would say. Or at least it's a bad analogy. How about that? So, I mean, imagine you get to the point where it's like, okay, we have to decide how we deal with these nukes. Well, would you want to be the side that gets a cash payout, whereas the other side gets all the nukes? Probably not. Uh, we have the issue that the bulk of the land based nuclear force is in red states. Depending on which maps you look at, it's somewhere between 90 and 100% of the missiles are all parked in red states. So you're talking about an enormous undertaking to divvy those out. And just as much as you wouldn't want to be on the cash settlement side of a nuclear a trade deal, uh, the blue states certainly aren't going to let these missiles sit there. Uh, so you're going to have to come up with some splitting solution. And if you look at the situation where, when the Soviet Union broke up, a large chunk of their nuclear forces were in Ukraine, uh, and massive international intervention occurred to guarantee that none of those nukes would stay behind in Ukraine and they'd all make it back to the Soviet Union. So if it gets serious, there's a possibility that the world may intervene on behalf of the side that they consider to be the most rational and help make decisions for us. And that doesn't even get into nuclear based missile submarines, which would be even more fun to try to figure out. So let's get into that big sticking point that essentially triggered the Civil War: military bases. Who gets them and who gets their equipment? So, how do we not make the same mistake? Do we really think that the federal government, because it's not going to be the two sides sitting down and saying, okay, yeah, we're all going to split up and go our own way. There's going to be one group that says, okay, we're done being part of you, because people in power are not necessarily rational about that power. They don't shrug their shoulders and say, well, I was in charge of the entire country one day, and then the next I just gave up and let half of the states go their own way. Very unlikely. So the process either is going to end up with the bases remaining under the control of one side while sitting in the land of another, or there's going to be the awkward problem of trying to figure out how you're going to divvy this stuff up. If you do shut down a federal base, let's say, trying to think of something I actually have some experience. Okay, yeah, let's say Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. So let's assume Missouri becomes a red state, and they say, okay, yeah, well, you can't, we're pulling out of Fort Leonard Wood. So you think that Washington D.C. is going to leave all those tanks and armored personnel carriers and uh, artillery behind, or they're going to let us divvy them up. Uh, you create a situation where even if they do peacefully give up the base, they're probably not going to peacefully give up the equipment, and ends up into a situation where the amount of trigger points for starting another civil war would be massive. Okay, so let's just assume for fun that somehow we're able to work this all out, where both sides say, okay, yeah, here's how we divvy up the nukes, here's how we divvy up the tanks, here's how we divvy up the aircraft carriers for a bunch of states that are mostly inland. All this, and we figure out how to actually do this, and both sides kind of go do their own thing. So, do you really think Blue America is going to leave Red America alone? Do you think the two are going to live side by side with each other? If you look at the mentality of those I would call the blues, the idea of a bunch of states off doing their own thing without them to have some form of control over it, I don't see them just going, oh, well, that it's done, they're gone. These are the same people that are screwing around in every single country on the planet. This is the same people who essentially think every single country's election uh, requires our input, and that if our side in the election wins, it's a victory, and if their side wins, it's not. So I find it very laughable to think that the same group of people who can't leave the smallest country in the middle of Africa alone is going to leave something alone that's right next to them, especially if there's any kind of power differential. And one of the problems we would see in terms of power is a lot of the finances would end up over on the blue side. Okay, so what happens if they decide to screw around with our ability to do financial transactions internationally around the world? Well, look just what happened to Russia recently. They pretty much got their financial system shut down because they were persona non grata with the finance system. What about communications? Can we guarantee that the communications crossing from red areas to blue areas back to red areas won't be messed with? And by the way, if you say, well, yeah, I think so, you're high, because they're screwing with our communications internally right now. If you somehow kicked the NSA out of Nebraska, you really think they're going to let communications flow freely around? They're going to be intercepting it. They're going to be decoding and cracking. They're going to be suppressing. They're going to be reordering. Essentially, our communication system will be a mess. And we'll be at the brunt end of propaganda because every other nation on the planet is dealing with US propaganda. So we can pretty much guarantee that we'll be under a never ending wave of blue propaganda. And we also would have to deal with the problem of trade restrictions. If you look at just like something like how California does things right now, where they implement all their own restrictions on everything, all these environmental laws on products that if a product is sold in California, it has to meet these standards. That doesn't have to be met anywhere else in the United States. You don't think Blue America would adopt the same kind of system, basically making it either impossible for us to sell things or transship them because they're dangerous. And I mean, to put it, and just to sum up, I mean, again, Tom Woods, Michael Malice, some of my favorite people. Anything I said here, I don't mean to be disrespectful from them. I just think these points of negotiation they talk about aren't quibbles. And I think it's necessary if you're planning on making this a real thing or more concrete, you have to actually start discussing how you broach these problems now rather than hoping it comes somehow works its way to a head and works out well. Personally, I'd love to see it. I am not fond of the current status quo. I don't know how how many sub states would be functional. But there's another issue, of course, when you start getting smaller and smaller in size in terms of population and economy, you tend to become more of a victim of larger powers that decide they want to mess with your internal affairs, which is something they would have to seriously look at in terms of what would happen in aftermath. So, in the comment section below, tell me what you think. Are you familiar with national divorce? Do you think it has any likelihood of happening in our lifetime. Do you think such a thing can happen peacefully, or is violence going to be inevitable? Again, comment below. Interested to hear what you have to say. Please smash the like button. If you've stumbled across this through the YouTube algorithm, please consider subscribing to my site. And also, if there's somebody out there you think would find this interesting, please share this with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.